Good late afternoon, everybody. It is my distinct pleasure and honor to introduce Camilla Benbow as our distinguished interviewee. Camilla is the Dean of the College of Education at Vanderbilt University and a real hero of mine personally, and certainly has been the impetus behind much of my research on tilt, as you know. So there's going to be a little bit of a change in the historical plans for these interviews this time, in part because Camilla is going to be interviewed by Elsbeth Stern, as opposed to being interviewed by David Lubinsky, who normally conducts the interviews, but is, as you know, Camilla's husband, and therefore knows all the little details, and we thought we'd give Elsbeth an opportunity to share those with the audience. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Elsbeth. Thank you so much, Camilla.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you so much. It's really a very big and distinguished honor for me to do this interview. I know the big footsteps I'm stepping into. And you, Camilla, are among the most famous researchers on gifted education and on giftedness. Your really exceptional scientific contribution is that you kept alive one of the most important longitudinal studies in psychology, the study of the mathematical precocious youth. This study was founded by your supervisor, but it's thanks to you that it still that it goes on. You further developed it, and there were very distinguished new insights from this study, generally on intelligence, but also on gifted education. We will come to this later, but I will follow the tradition David had that we first talk about your personal educational experience. I know you were born in the south of Sweden. I also know your father was a physicist who took his young family to Caltech, with you also. It sounds like a privileged educational background, but I also know from some people I emailed, and guess who gave me their email addresses, that it wasn't always that easy. You had a lot of multicultural experience. I knew that you went from Sweden to the US. What I only learned from somebody else is that you also were in the meantime in Germany and in the UK, in Cambridge. As I said, a lot of cultural educational experience. You had to adapt to new languages. And my first question is, and probably you can tell a lot about it, my assumption always was that you were a highly intelligent, ambitious, and determined child. The people I asked, they always used these words. So my questions were of high convergent validity. But my question is, did you have the feeling you could unfold your potential in all these educational settings, or did you also have some mixed experience?
Well, let me just talk a little bit about my educational experiences, and I am going to go back a bit because I think it really will tell everyone a bit about who I am at the core. As you mentioned, I was born in Lund, Sweden, and my mother put me into a Montessori preschool, so I think that says a little bit about my parents. And then I went to school in Sweden. But then my father had a postdoc at Caltech, and so he uprooted us when I was 9 years old and took us to Pasadena, California. Well, I knew no English at the time. Well, I had 3 words: yes, no, and cinnamon. And now you may wonder why cinnamon, but in Sweden in those days, the spice rack really had the English name, and on the back was a label with the Swedish name. And I had made a bet with my friend that the Swedish name was not the English name. And of course I was correct. But anyway, so those were the 3 words. And so you can imagine coming to America, and they decided at the time when I got there that since I didn't know any English, why don't we skip her in school? Why don't we skip the 3rd grade, put her into 4th grade, and if she doesn't learn English in time, she hasn't lost any time. So she'll be with her peers. Well, I did learn English quickly, and in I was conversational in about 4 months. I mean, limited vocabulary. Well, so 7 years passed in America, and I had a wonderful public school experience there in Pasadena. They had wonderful programs for people who were determined and motivated. And so I benefited from things that I later learned were part of gifted programs, but I didn't know at the time. So they had doubled me up in math. I'd started algebra early, took 2 years of math in 1 year, and did a few things. Well, then all of a sudden, we moved to Germany, and we moved to Darmstadt, Germany. I had not taken German in school. I'd taken French and Latin. Given my previous experience, I kind of had thought that, I'll just pick up German like that. And I was put into a German school, and all of a sudden, my brain just was not at the same place as it was when I was 9. And it took me quite some time to even learn when one word ended and one word started. So after about 6 months in school, the director of the school talked to my parents and said, your daughter is bright. She ought to go to the university, but she doesn't have time to learn German and be ready for the university. You need to find another form of education. So in the end, and I know this is a long answer, but I think you'll see why I mention it, I was homeschooled. And now in the 1970s, homeschooling was very unusual. So I was homeschooled for 2 years. Luckily, my dad could help me with my calculus, and those were some of the best times in my life. And I was homeschooled, and then I went to Cambridge, and I was 1 year in Cambridge before I came to Hopkins. And then at Hopkins is where I got my and then all of a sudden my education became more typical. But I think because of all these changes in schools and everything, I always felt challenged. But I also was given extra challenges. So I had an excellent education. I was very pleased.
Mm. Yeah, so did you go to a German gymnasium or did you
Gymnasium,
have...
yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Buchschule.
Yeah, okay, yeah. So my next question would be, you almost answered it, did your educational experience have an impact on the field you specialized in, gifted education?
Not really. What had happened, you can see where I've been in gifted, was that I was still an undergraduate. And my first husband came up to me, having read the Hopkins Gazette, which was the newsletter, and had said, Camilla, there is this really famous professor in the psychology department. I just read about his work, and it's really, really interesting. You ought to take a class from him. And his name was Julian Stanley. I read the article, and I said, I sure will. Mm-hmm. And I took a course on psychological testing. And luckily for me, while he did teach us about psychological testing, he also spoke a lot about his study of gifted kids. And I was just fascinated by it. So while I had always thought since 8th grade that I was going to be a psychologist, I was babysitting, had gotten a hold of an introductory undergraduate textbook when I was babysitting and looked at it and thought, trying to understand why people behave the way they do, this is just for me. But that class took me in a very different direction because I thought I was going to become a clinical psychologist. Thank goodness I didn't, because I would have been miserable in that, and probably any clients would have been miserable with me.
Of course, you almost answered my next question already. It's quite. Your father was physicist. I know one of your brothers is professor for physiology at Humboldt University in Berlin. So why did you go into psychology and not into a STEM field, given this background? Yeah.
I like people.
Okay, yeah.
And I like people's behavior. And, I was good at math, but it didn't excite me. you know?
Yeah, I can understand because
Yeah.
I also wanted to become psychologist when I was 15 years old. Also, I didn't know any psychologist, but I also wanted to understand human behavior.
Yes, it was like, why do people do the crazy things they do?
So, many academic careers have been determined more by chance than by choice.
Yes.
Of course, you can't always choose what you want. Probably you can choose the first step, but then the other steps are determined. This seems not to be the case in your case, because you already went to Johns Hopkins and to Julian Stanley to go into this gifted education research area.
Well, in some ways, I kind of knew, and I think most people, at least from looking for more study, tend to have a sense of where they're heading, but they don't have an exact destination. And I knew I liked psychology, but exactly what part of psychology? I mean, you think about psychology, it's pretty broad. It can be very biological to computer intensive. So you had a lot of choices therein. And so it was that article that I read was the chance factor that I think turned my career and started that trajectory and the journey that I have been on for now 50 years. I know, I don't want to even say it, but yes, I've been on that journey for 50 years.
Yeah, Johns Hopkins had a very good psychology department, many different fields, and still were there other areas of psychology that fascinated you and that you would probably have liked to specialize in?
Yes, at Caltech, Roger Sperry was doing all the work in the early 70s on the split brains. And I thought that was fascinating. So I have always had an interest in neuroscience and understanding the mechanisms of that. So it's always was something that I was reading at the time on my own, but at Hopkins, that really didn't afford me that opportunity. But it has always been a little bit of my interest. So I've always dabbled a little bit in that area because I kind of thought it was interesting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, then probably we will go to your longitudinal study, the mathematical precocious youth. The results of these studies have challenged a lot of assumptions about intelligence in general, but also about education. What's the nature of intelligence? What are the best systems to serve really gifted students, also to their benefit and the benefit of the society? Some questions are still controversially discussed. One is, of course, what's the importance of specialized abilities? TILT, we discussed it here frequently, and what is the contribution of general intelligence? But before we come to these questions, probably you can say 3 major insights of this study where you are most proud of or you would consider the most important ones.
Well, I would put them into maybe 3 categories because there isn't just one paper. I think when you've been doing a study for 50 years, the science accumulates. And so it's hard to say, is there one thing? I think, one of our major contributions is just to show the predictive power of cognitive abilities. I think the power to say that at age 12, we can use a simple test that's 2 hours long, and that the results of that test can predict educational, occupational, and creative outcomes almost 50 years later, I think is a pretty powerful finding. That you can just give a 2-hour test and you can identify the future pool of innovators and creatives, I think was important. And the other aspect of that is that there's always this belief out there that, the threshold effect, that after a certain point of inability, more ability doesn't matter. That it's really other things are important. They contribute. So let's say you draw a line at 130 IQ, and after that it doesn't matter. Well, other things do matter. That's for sure. But if you can hold those other things constant, more ability is better. And I think that goes against a lot of common wisdom. But there's a huge range in ability. And yes, more ability matters. You've heard about tilts. I'm not going to mention the tilt. But the other thing that, we have worked with, and I, as we're talking about this, I want to say that this has been a partnership. It's not just been my work. David Lubinsky and I have been collaborators on this. So when I talk about the work, it's our work, it's our findings, and we have wonderful students like Gabriella over here who have helped us over the years. So please, even if I use the word I sometime, I mean to say we. But this work, and then the importance of spatial ability, and the fact that we don't measure spatial abilities in our schools, yet it's such an important ability, especially for engineering, the arts, and that underappreciation of that. That's one cluster. The other cluster, and I won't go into it as long, is just the importance of educational interventions. And that I was a little surprised by this finding, but interventions in adolescence, we can detect the signal 35 years later. We intervene in adolescence, and those individuals in their mid-30s and 40s are performing much better than a comparison group that we can try to control as much as possible, who didn't have the intervention. They're all highly gifted. They were all, matched by propensity score matching. But those who had the intervention were way ahead, and the other group never caught up. I think that's really an important thing. So while Brooke on Sunday talked about mentioning the kind of myth of exercising the brain, I say exercising the brain is a very important thing, very important. And the third thing, which could not go unnoted, is, of course, the thing that in a way launched me but made me infamous, and that's the sex differences work. We did find sex differences in abilities, but also how our men and women in our sample compose a life. And they make different choices, and they have different values and orientations, and as a result, they lead very different lives, but they're equally satisfied. So abilities, interventions, and those sex differences.
Yeah. I have prepared one thing I'm not too convinced of, and this is the role of spatial abilities. Of course, I know your results. I know that, the achievement in this paper folding or mental rotation or whatever predicts really STEM careers 30 years later. So it's an impressive result. Myself, I'm also very interested in predictors of STEM abilities. But the more I read about spatial abilities, the more confused I guess, because sometimes you find impact, sometimes you don't. We ran a big study with ETH students. We predicted their achievement in the first exam, and ETH students are not as selective as your students were, but our mathematics and physics students, they are quite bright. We also ran intelligence tests. What we found was that neither mathematical subtests nor spatial subtests really were good predictors, but verbal subtests. So it really meant that those who really excelled in their first exams, they needed good verbal abilities. And many of my colleagues here in mathematics, and they are very bright and very good, they say the most important thing for mathematicians is to use language appropriately.
Well, I'm not a mathematician, but because we've been working with the study of mathematically precocious youth, I talk to them a lot. And they say that there are two types. There's one, the algebraic, and the one, the more geometric. And so I think it depends on what type you were working with. And also, so I do think that there are roles for both. And I also think that with spatial ability, it also depends on what measure you're using, because it's the rotational, more challenging ones that stand out. So it depends, again, what test you were using. And I haven't read your work, so I can't comment, but sometimes people self-select themselves into it, and then you've reduced the variance. So I don't know if that's another factor. But yes, I've seen some differences, but clearly in our sample, when we do have the spatial ability test, it makes our predictions much better. It refines our predictions.
I believe the results, but I still think we are missing a process, a theory, or why you really really need exceptional spatial abilities to be good in mathematics. Of course, representing content or non-spatial content with the help of spatial representations is very important. It's basic for science. But why do you need these exceptional abilities in these mental rotation tests?
I don't know if you need it in all kinds of math, but in some. And I think that might be the difference. But I know in physics, for example, you have to be high in everything.
I fully agree.
And they are. Engineers tend to be more high in math and spatial, a little lower in verbal. It's just the patterns. Yeah.
And I agree with you that probably we don't exploit spatial abilities currently to the way we should use, because in school we learn a lot about mathematics and verbal competences, but still, to use a diagram or to even use it actively to draw one is still a little bit neglected, I think. I think we would. STEM achievement would probably become better if this competence would be trained too.
I fully agree with you. I think schools are very verbal. And I think many boys, because of that, sometimes get lost into schools because they like to work with their hands, they're visual. And I don't think we nurture those kids who are high in spatial ability and maybe high in math because the way we teach is so verbally loaded. And they start developing concepts of themselves as, I'm not a good learner. It's not that they're not good learners. They just learn differently. Their style of learning is different than the way the teachers are presenting it. And so many, like in math education today, so much of math education in America, they talk about that we got to talk about the math, and we got to do it descriptively and work it through. Well, the spatially and mathematically gifted kids, they just see it. It's just you go from here to there. They don't need to talk about it. But that is a different way of teaching, and it doesn't tap into those kids who learn in a different way. So I agree with you. I think we lose kids in our educational system who are really high on spatial ability because we don't nurture that ability, and they don't feel that schools are a place for them.
The tilt. Some people think there are special mathematical abilities. I know, but David really believes in them. I'm not too convinced. I still think to be good in mathematics, you have to be highly intelligent, you need a very high G factor, and you need good instruction. Why should we have a certain mathematical ability? Of course we have a number sense. We are born with a number sense. But our brain, the architecture of our brain developed 40,000 years ago. And mathematics, the way we use it today, was just invented a few hundred years ago. So I'm not sure whether we really have special mathematical abilities for advanced mathematics. Of course, we have number sense, but I'm not convinced that we really have special abilities for understanding calculus. Of course, we need intelligence, we need probably some special ways of representation, but why should evolution have prepared us for mathematics, given that all this kind of mathematics only was invented about a few hundred years ago?
Well, you know, one of the things when I was talking about sex differences long ago is that I mentioned that there are really three types of mathematical abilities. There's calculation, and then there is, you know, applying concepts that you've already learned, and then there's the math reasoning. But, you know, what you're talking about is number sense. It's more like calculation. But what people have talked about is that those abilities are co-opted and developed, and you develop these secondary abilities. So yes, they may not have been important early on, and they are more developed abilities. And that's why we see that schooling has a much bigger impact on mathematical achievement than does, you know, reading, for example, in school. So if you look at verbal abilities, math abilities, and how they develop, schooling has a much bigger impact on the eventual achievement in mathematics. And we've noticed that with COVID, when schools weren't functioning, the math scores went really down. And partly that's, you know, when you're at home, you're in an environment with vocabulary, or you're reading, you develop those abilities, not just in school, but you don't tend to sit down and do math unless you just happen to love it and you would work with it. So schools have a really important role in developing those mathematical abilities. So yeah, it's a secondary ability rather than a primary.
Yeah, I would like to come to educational implications. The question is, of course, should we have separate schools for gifted? In the Central European countries, people think, or the school system, you know, we have this tracking system, academic track and vocational track. And for a long time, politicians and also everybody thought this is enough for really addressing the different cognitive abilities. We now know this is, of course, not the case, but is the solution that we really have further separations, or having probably a gifted school than a school for a little bit more intelligent but not gifted? So the question is really, how much separation do we need, or to put it another way, how should we manage diversity?
You know, I think I'm going to go back to a little bit back to Julian and our beginnings of our work. And just to kind of, as a context for my answer, you know, in the 70s and early 80s, Julian Stanley, you know, he started to study in 71. I joined in 1976. But when we started doing specialized classes, not a whole school, but just specialized classes in math, fast-paced math. Then we moved on to science. And we did this because Julian thought, and you know, we've got to give him the credit because I was just a student, so I was learning from him, that he was really worried that if gifted children weren't challenged, their love of learning would extinguish. They would lose their curiosity. And so he developed these special math classes. But what we never figured out, and we still don't know, is whether when we did this intervention academically, whether we benefited the kids more socially or academically. Because what these kids really, they loved being challenged in math, but they also loved being with kids who are like them, who understand their jokes, who share their interests, where they're not labeled as the brain in the class. And so when we run programs for gifted kids, they're not only you know, learning, you know, advanced content, but they're also working with their peers in a different way, and it's very satisfying. So I'm not a proponent for separate schools for the gifted, I don't think you need to do that. But what I do think, and there are good schools for the gifted, and great, have those. I'm not against them. But if you're advanced in math, what you need is an adjustment in your math curriculum. What you need is more challenges in math. You may not need an adjustment in your English class or another class. So my feeling is that you should respond to the talents of the child. So what I'd like to say is use the curriculum that we have available to us for older kids for the younger kids who are gifted, because that's where they're functioning. They're advanced. That's where the name precocious was really turned out to be a good name, because these kids were precocious. And when we did studies on their cognitive abilities, and I remember there was a faculty member, Veronica Dark, and I at Iowa State University. And she was a cognitive psychologist, and we were trying to look at how do they process information. And we had some of the different memory tasks, short-term, long-term, and so on. And, so what we had our gifted students. So I would be bringing in the gifted students who were in our summer programs, because one of my beliefs has always been that you have to put your knowledge into practice. So all through my life, while we've been doing these longitudinal studies, understanding gifted kids, I have always run programs for gifted kids. And I have programs at Vanderbilt for gifted kids. I don't run them directly myself, but I'm involved. I just feel that you gotta put the knowledge into use and have an impact on kids today, not just tomorrow. So anyway, back to Veronica Dark. We were running summer programs. We ran our research. We brought in the kids. And we also had a control group or a comparison group, to be honest, of typical kids of the same age and college students who were 4 to 5 years older. And we ran them on the same tasks. And what we found was that there was no point bringing in the same age peers, because all we found was that our kids did better. Mm-hmm. And what we found was that our kids, they had high SAT scores like the college students, and they were processing information in the same way. So therefore, it kind of gave more support for the fact that they're precocious. What they need is access to advanced curricula, and if you want to enrich it and go deeper, that's great. I think you want acceleration and enrichment, but I don't think that you necessarily have to develop specialized schools. What you have to make sure is that each child is being challenged every day so that their reach exceeds their grasp. That's what Julian always said. Their reach should exceed their grasp. They should always be given materials that's just a little bit more challenging than where they are today. But I don't think that necessarily, and I'm not against it, but it's not necessary to have separate schools. But it does mean opening up the curriculum and not worrying about age. And as I say, think about it in any other domain. Do you sign up your children for tennis lessons on the basis of age? We don't have age 7 or age 8 tennis lessons, or age 7 or age 8 ski lessons, or age 7 or age 8 piano lessons, and so on and so on. And we don't buy shoes by age either. So why do we teach math and reading and all the school subjects by age? It doesn't make sense. And so do what you do in other domains with the academic domains. That's my theory.
I fully agree. The question is, of course, how to manage it, because a school is a very complicated system. And,
it is
and we can't have a curriculum for every child. But I also agree that having more freedom within the school would already help a lot. But how do you select the children? Because selection is a big thing. You could overlook gifted kids who come from minorities or from groups who are a little bit underserved when it comes to economic resources and so on. Are you concerned that you overlook these kind of kids who have really potential, but they couldn't show it?
One measure isn't going to find all the kids. But we were rather surprised. So David and I, in the 90s, decided that, we wanted to have a comparison group of individuals who everybody would agree was talented, but was not identified by the same criterion. So what we did was to go into the very top graduate programs in the United States and in the STEM areas, and said, could you to your graduate students who are 24, 25 years old, could you give this survey to them? And we paid them to fill out the survey. We got their GRE scores and so on. And the survey was retrospective and eventually became prospective. And one of the questions that we had in the survey was to ask these individuals who, whether they had ever participated in the talent search and taken the SAT as a 12-year-old. And we were astounded by something like 90% saying that they had, or they would have qualified if they hadn't. And many had, and provided us with their SAT scores. So I do think we capture many of them, probably not all, but what this test does is, because Julian chose this test for a reason. He wanted to know who are the exceptional reasoners in math. And so he wanted to have a test where the content of the test was not something that was taught in school. So no matter whether you were part of a rich curriculum or not such a good curriculum, you wanted something that nobody had been taught. And at the time in the 7th grade, in the 70s, nobody had been taught algebra. That was a 9th grade subject. And there were some places where you can get it in 8th grade. But, in 7th grade, no one had. And so what we were looking for was kids who were given novel math problems who could figure out how to solve them even though they had never been taught how to do it. And that's what we identified, were kids who could figure out how to solve these algebra problems, these geometry problems, even though they've never been taught. And later on, it found out that they really didn't know algebra and geometry. They just could reason their way through it. And I want to say, it's kind of interesting to me, for those of you who are in America, there has been a push for a long time that we have to get rid of the GRE tests and SATs in terms of selecting people for the university or for graduate school, because supposedly they're biased. They're not. But supposedly they're biased. So as a result of their bias, certain groups are not getting into the best universities and the best graduate programs. Well, now, so they got rid of them. And during COVID, many got rid of them because you couldn't give the test. But now, after the experience of not having tests, these universities are returning to the GRE and bringing the GRE back. And the graduate record exam. So this is the exam that they use to select people for graduate school, for doctoral work. And they tell the story of why they're doing it, which was the very story why they developed the SAT in the 1920s in the first place. And they developed the SAT in the 1920s, that test, because they felt that the best universities were only open to the privileged class who could go to boarding schools and elite schools, and that there were kids who came from less rigorous educational school systems who were excluded because they didn't have that pedigree. And so what they said was, what if you take a kid from, say, an impoverished area in the United States, and there is no test score to show what their abilities are, and they apply to Harvard or to Hopkins or Vanderbilt, and they say, and the principal and the teachers say, this is the best student we've ever had. What would people say? Sure, but what does that mean when you come from a curriculum that's that low level? But what if you had then the high test scores? That gives validity to it. And the reason the universities now are saying that they're going back to the graduate record exam is because they say that not having the tests means that they are not finding kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds, and they need to bring the tests back so kids from economically disadvantaged backgrounds also have a chance to get into the very best schools. And so I kind of laugh because in 100 years, we've gone full circle. In 1926, if I have the date right, David probably knows what the date is, that's when the SAT was developed, or the College Board, but it was around that time. And here we are 100 years later, and the very same rationale is being used as to why we're going back to it. So I kind of smile, and I will just, so to me, there is no procedure that will find every single kid. But what I have seen anecdotally is that over time, I've worked with lots of kids, and there are so many kids we have identified where the parents did not realize that they were gifted, where the schools did not realize where they were gifted, and they were shocked by the test scores. And all of a sudden, when they saw those test scores, and they saw how bright that child was, opportunities came to them. And I think, so can I find everyone? No. But can I find many? Yes. And I feel very satisfied with that work.
Yeah, I also think that intelligence tests can contribute a lot to finding underprivileged kids.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I sometimes, when it comes to admission to the gymnasium, I very often recommend to use them as an additional predictor or selection criterion.
It's one variable. There are other variables, but it definitely, you should not be throwing away information. That's what you're doing, is throwing away information.
Yeah, I would like to change the perspective a little bit, because you are not only an exceptional scientist, but you're also an exceptional science manager. You accepted the position as a dean at Peabody College in Vanderbilt 25 years ago. So you are dean for 25 years. I was dean here for 3 years, and in Central European universities, it's only a short period you are dean. And in the last half year, you count the days so that things would be over, because you don't have a lot of power. You are often the scapegoat for things that didn't work well. So it's really, the rule is, of course, you should never vote for somebody who wants to become dean. You have to be persuaded to become dean, because, otherwise people would misuse this little bit of power they have in Central European universities. But you stayed in this position for 25 years. What makes it attractive? What kind of not only power, but ways to really develop new ideas, new educational impact does your position have?
Well, I didn't become dean. I became dean by a chance factor.
Okay.
I did not think that, I never thought that leadership of being a dean was part of my professional identity. I actually had a role model whom I thought, that's who I want to be when I'm in my 50s. And it's somebody everybody here knows. It was Sandra Scar. That's when I was, in my 20s, early 30s. She was my role model. I wanted to be just like her. I admired her. And then, and I will just tell you how it was chance factors that I got in. First, it was a chance factor that I became a department chair of psychology at Iowa State University. There was 2 factions in the department. The department chair said, I don't want to do this for any longer than 3 years. The dean said, we're not going outside for a candidate to be a department chair. You got to find someone in. But we were at odds. But both sides said, Camilla, we trust you. For somehow I had the trust of both sides. And so they convinced me to become department chair. And I found out that I liked it. That was a surprise because I was doing it grudgingly. Because I kept saying, I have my research, I have this, I want to do this. And all of a sudden, I noticed that I was a little bit in flow because I could create positive change. And so I had been reappointed as department chair in psychology. And then this is my story, how the deanship came up. It was summer. I was very comfortably dressed. I was at the office working on a manuscript. I was dressed just like a faculty member is dressed in the summer working. And all of a sudden, I got a call from the provost office at Iowa State saying the provost, and the provost is the dean's report to the provost. The provost wants to get your advice on something, Camilla. And I'm sitting here thinking, what have I done? I do push the envelope, but I don't think I ever crossed the line, and I was really worried. And she said, could you come over and be there in 10 minutes? And I'm looking at myself like, oh my gosh, look at me. I can't go home and change clothes. But then I realized how nervous I was about what in the world is he going to talk to me about? That I was glad I only had 10 minutes to wait because I was scared. I thought of everything I had done that touched a line, but I didn't think cross, nothing to take me to the provost office. And then he sprung it on me that the dean of education, which was, of course, in a different college than I was in, had suddenly resigned, giving 2 weeks' notice. And Camilla, would you consider being the dean of education? And I was like, well, I'm happy where I was. I don't know. I don't know. This is where I feel like this is my professional home is psychology, not education. Obviously, he prevailed. And I became dean at Iowa State, an interim dean for 2 years. And I found again that I loved it. And one of the things that I found was that I actually loved education too. I loved psychology and its theories and its methods, but I loved the practicality and the real world of working in education. And so I realized I had missed that part in my development. And that's why when I went to Vanderbilt, it was a perfect match for me because Peabody College is a college of education and human development. It has 2 psychology-like departments and 3 education departments. And it's a place where both education and psychology could be nourished. And I loved it. And by the way, talking about full circle, I'm ending my career at Peabody College, but Julian Stanley began his career at Peabody College. And so I feel that this has gone full circle. His last graduate student is finishing up there. But why do I love it? I love it partly because it's really taking what I study, which is talent development. That's what I study. And applying it. So as dean, I view myself as creating the conditions where talents can thrive, flourish, and become all that they can be. And isn't that what universities are? Places of talent development? Faculty are developing talents, students are developing their talents. And what I love is to take what I have learned about talent development and apply it in my administrative work and to see others flourish. But that's what I was doing with kids, or I still do with kids, is to take what I know and seeing them flourish. And now I can see what I say, my gifted kids grown up, and seeing them flourish. And that's what makes me enjoy my role. And because that's the perspective that I put. It's not about pushing papers and doing things. It's about talents and excellence and helping people be the best that they can be. And that gives me a lot of satisfaction.
I fully understand. You have also a teacher education program, of course.
Oh, yes.
I'm also running here the teacher education program. So my question is, what's special about your teacher education program? So what do you think does a good teacher need? How should we select future teachers, and how should we educate them?
Well, teachers, the research says that what separates really strong teachers, there's only one variable that separates really strong teachers from less good teachers. All the research that have looked at it, there's one variable. Can you guess what it is? Verbal ability. So since we are here at ISIR, I think maybe none of you are shocked. But again, my development of talent, I think Peabody College is known for developing truly excellent teachers, and we take great pride in that. We're one of the few places one of the few universities that actually does teacher education at the undergraduate and graduate level and at all areas. But you got to develop talents. And so, yes, we pick very, very talented students to become teachers. Their SATs and GREs are really, really high. And then we provide them with a rich educational experience. And as what we say at Peabody, we craft our teachers one at a time. And so it's not a huge program, it's a small program that's very individualized. So again, talent development, taking talented individuals and then being responsive to their talents and really giving them a rich experience. And I think, that's the key. It's just talent development principles.
But it's not trivial to get really cognitively flexible people to become teachers, because it's not always the most attractive job. It was a very prestigious profession decades ago, but I think nowadays there are so many other options. So
that is true.
How do you get talented people into your college? They also could study at Harvard or whatever.
Well, I think that's the crisis in teacher education. Is not only that it's not seen as a career that has the honor that it used to have. But also in America, everybody, there's only negative comments about teachers. And I always say, if you keep attacking teachers and blaming teachers for all the ills, what talented student in their right mind is going to go into teaching when everybody says teachers are lousy? And I think that what we need to do is to change the way we talk about teaching and realize that in some way education is just a weak intervention. Think about how many hours in a day a child is in school compared to outside of school, compared to their families and culture and all these other things. But everybody blames teachers for achievement gaps. But what we saw during COVID, and this was in America, and I thought this was a natural experiment. What happens when schools could not function properly and kids were taught online? 5-year-olds were taught online. 6-year-olds were taught online. That's ridiculous. Schools were not functioning properly. And what happened? Test scores declined. So what did that say? Teachers make a difference. The achievement gap would be even bigger if we didn't have schools and teachers. And that we need to realize that many factors are contributing to educational outcomes. Teachers and schools are one of them, and they make the achievement gaps between rich kids and poor kids smaller. But I don't think it's reasonable to expect that they can maybe get rid of them all.
No.
And I think blaming teachers and the negativity towards teaching as a career turns people away because it isn't just money. People say, oh, you don't earn much to be a teacher. But a lot of talented kids go into careers that don't pay well, but they feel that they're honored.
I'm very happy you really say that teachers are important in this group, because a lot of intelligence researchers don't estimate the role of teachers. Therefore, please remember the message.
Yeah.
At the end, I would like to come to your personal life. You not only had a very steep academic career, also your personal accomplishments are exceptional. And long before reconciling family and career was a matter of discussion, you just did it. You did not raise one child, not two, not three, but 7 children. So she's mother of 7. Yeah. This is, of course, exceptional, and I had the chance to talk to 2 of them. There was nothing new for me, that you are really dedicated. You you were supportive, but they also had a lot of freedom. But I liked very much, I, of course, Googled a lot, and I found the dissertation of your son, Wüsten. He is a physicist in Harvard, and in his preface, in his dissertation, he especially thanked you. And he said, no matter what life seems to throw at her, she always perseveres and ultimately succeeds. This was what he wrote almost 20 years ago. There are many young women here in the audience, and many now, of course, want to have family and career. Probably not all of them want to have 7 kids, but 1 of 2. I thought whether I should ask this little bit trivial question, but nonetheless, I thought I end this interview with asking you to give recommendations to young women who really want to have a career, but also want to have a family.
Well, when I look back at my path, I'm not sure how I did it. You know, I look back and I say, how in the world did you accomplish that? But every day you just got up and you did it, and you put one foot in front of the others and you moved forward. But, you know, having 7 children was very chaotic and challenging, and luckily my older kids helped out a lot to make it possible. But I go back to my Sandra Scar, who was my model. And I remember she met with a group of graduate students in psychology who asked the very same question: how can you be successful and have a career in psychology and a family? And her answer was, and I agree with her totally, it was my experience, you have to invest in high quality daycare for your kids. And what you have to be able to do is to be able to leave, know that they're in good hands, focus on your work, and then when you come home, you focus on them. You needed to be able to separate it. And so I think when I remember, and I thought about this a lot, you know, when I was a graduate student and working with Julie and Stanley, I had kids. My first child was, I was still an undergraduate when I had my first child. And we invested in daycare. It meant we had no money. I mean, times were tight. And just to give you a sense, I would always rush to the bathroom before I went home so that I wouldn't waste toilet paper. That's how it was. And, but I felt what I was doing was investing in my career. And what I think about for young people today, and this is the same concept as in saving for retirement. They say, if you put $1,000 in the bank at age 18 and you don't touch it, by the time you retire, it's going to be a large sum. I have no idea what it would become today, but a huge sum. If at 40 you put that same $1,000 in, actually, in order to get the same sum, you have to put many, many more $1,000 in each, to catch up. I think that the same applies to you as a scientist. So you think about, the accruals, but what you do in your early career makes such a difference in the long run. When I was a graduate student, if I had 3 papers published or 2 papers published versus 1, it was a huge difference. And all those articles are still working for me. All those articles. So when you're young, you need to invest in your career and develop those articles. And don't worry, as we did, I didn't have the money then, but we put it all towards quality childcare so that I could, and that when I came home, I could be with the kids. And I spent my time, it was family and that. But my advice is invest in that so that you can also invest without guilt into your career. Don't feel guilty, and know that they're in good hands. And as when I looked at what my child care providers did for my kids, I thought to myself, I would have never done that if I was a stay-at-home mom. I couldn't have done that. So you can do it. It means being really, really good with managing your time and putting your time towards those priorities. And in the long run, so many of the things that I missed when I didn't have money, in the long run, they made no difference. But the time I put towards my family, the time I put towards my career, they do, and they are still working for me. Yeah. So that's my advice is think about it. At age 60, if you publish 3 articles versus 2, it's not going to make a difference. But when you're young, it makes a huge difference. So think about that. And of course it's hard. Of course it's hard. It's not easy. And it does involve a lot of trade-offs. I've never had much time for friends, because when I had free time, I spent it with my family. So you just have to decide for yourself what trade-offs make sense for you and what's valuable for you. And I can't say in the end, you have to construct or compose a satisfying life. You have to decide what are your priorities and what you want. And you have to decide where are the compromises to be made. I can't tell you. All I can say is, here are the variables, and just know if you don't do this, this is what happens. You need to make informed choices. But there are no right or wrong answers. For me, these were the right answers. For somebody else, it may mean I would rather not be on such a steep trajectory, because for me, I have other interests that I want to nourish. And I wouldn't be satisfied if I couldn't nourish those interests. That wasn't that important to me, so I could easily do the trade-offs. But I think you just have to look at your values and say, what's really important? And I have no good advice except
I think it was a good advice, I think. Yeah.
So yes, you can do it.
Yeah.
Yes,
So I think this is a very
hard?
good
Yes.
word.
But is it rewarding?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. I would not have done it any different.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Camilla, for
Thank
this
you.
interview.